Torchwood has always been a series that dared to go where Doctor Who wouldn't dream of, like a lust-filled sex parasite infesting Wales, or a family of cannibals kidnapping and eating passers-by. But I never thought the dark and gritty descendant of Doctor Who would end up producing one of the most disturbing villains ever created. The 456 don't want world domination. They don't want to wipe out humanity or even overthrow Earth, at least not yet. What they want is quite simple.
We want your children. We will take your children.
But that alone doesn't make them a fictional fear. It's certainly menacing enough. An alien species descended onto Earth to take 10% of the world's children from us. That in itself is terrifying enough. But what makes the 456 truly disturbing is why they want them.
The heat. They create chemicals. The chemicals are good.
Good in what way?
We feel good.
They don't want children to survive. They don't need them for some species-defining medical breakthrough. They want to steal 10% of the world's children because it feels good. Because the children produce a chemical they can't find anywhere else. The children are a drug the 456 want to traffic across their species, like nothing more than a commodity for pleasure. Just let that sink in for a moment. Torchwood managed to create a villain that takes our inherent disgust for the violation of innocence, a concept most fundamentally reflected in some of the most heinous people on Earth, like paedophiles who corrupt children for their own pleasure, and combined it with a menacing alien species that has no preconception for the value of human life itself. A species who probably see us as nothing more than another terrarium in the ever-expanding universe. It's a combination I'd never considered before, but one that goes beyond terrifying to straight out disturbing. Yet somehow, despite this, it only gets worse when we realise what happens to these children. They become nothing more than mucousy appendages attached to the 456. There's barely any semblance of humanity left in whatever that thing is attached to the beast. But most agonising of all is that even though it's so unrecognisable, it's very much alive. At least in the most basic sense of the word. Its brain is still functional enough to produce faint signs of life. It's like they've extracted any semblance of humanity out of the children, along with the chemicals they need for the drug. It's the unholy trilogy of fictional fears for me. The act of taking the children, the motif behind using them as drugs, and then the method extracting the hit. It makes for a truly disturbing villain. But the 456 claim they don't harm the children, that they feel no pain and will live forever. But to state the child we saw attached to them begs to differ. What if the 456 have no conception of emotional pain? What if by feeling no pain they mean merely physical pain? What if they've misconstrued the human condition and only taken into account our evolutionary drive to survive, to avoid pain and reproduce? It makes sense that an alien species conducting the briefest of scans across our species might only register humanity on its fundamental nature as primates. And the way they use the phrase harm here really makes me think they mean physical, because from a human perspective it's almost unquestionable that psychologically, being bound to exist as a sack of chemicals attached to an alien creature for the rest of your life has to be almost incomprehensibly horrifying. To say that causes someone no pain would be to completely misunderstand any semblance of the human condition, almost completely disregarding the complexity of the human mind and reducing it down to our primal drives to survive and reproduce. Who's to say they didn't lobotomise the children, or use the same type of nanogene technology that altered the empty child's anatomy to numb all their pain receptors or even completely remove their ability to resist? Physically, the children generally might not feel any pain, no sharp stinging from the attachment procedure or aching from the chemical extraction. Maybe they really are just completely numb, but that doesn't negate the hellish reality of being completely or even partially conscious as they exist in this state, whatever this state might be. It actually begs the question of how the children actually produce the high for the 456 in the first place. What chemicals do they produce, and how are the 456 harvesting them? I came across this insane conspiracy that theorised Hollywood and political elites actually torture children in order to extract a chemical called adrenochrome from them, which is a chemical produced from the oxidation of adrenaline. And as outlandish as this theory is, given the evidence of adrenochrome already being available across the counter as a treatment and not viable at all as a high, it did provide the perfect segue for the 456. What if they work on a similar principle, where they thrive off a type of adrenochrome released by children in response to fear? Imagine the children bound to the 456 exist in a perpetual state of terror, terrified of this hideous beast they're attached to, of being stolen from Earth and stranded in an alien world, completely alone. Or even worse, what if they've engineered the children's amygdalas to become even more sensitive to fear-inducing stimulation? Imagine they've increased the intensity of fear the children can feel alongside subjecting them to this semi-conscious state. They'd be almost like human sponges with the sole purpose of absorbing terror and channeling it into the 456 to make them feel good. But even if their claim is true, if we were to take the 456 at face value and they don't harm the children and they will live forever, are we to believe that living forever is a gift? Even at the best of times, immortality is a curse. Just look at Captain Jack Harkness. But when you're the slimy, helpless growth attached to an alien species for pleasure, can existence be anything other than complete hell? Imagine trying to comprehend the prospect of immortality when the perpetual state of existence involves being a semi-conscious rucksack of chemicals for the alien. That's a fate to rival even Prometheus' eternal torment by Zeus. But one thing I can't wrap my head around is how they knew human children would produce the high for them in the first place. If they knew from their own research, then why couldn't they just create the chemicals themselves? If they discovered it by scouting out hundreds of different planets, then it stands to reason they visited Earth well before 1965. What if initially, before 1965, they were extracting children out without anyone even knowing? They clearly have the technology for that. It does make a lot of sense that they'd approach humanity for 12 children, given they have the technology to so easily extract them. But what if they realised there was a better way? A more lucrative plan to sustainably farm children from Earth? It's the moment Jack refuses their deal for the 10%, and they respond over and over again with,
You yielded in the past.
You're not getting one solitary single child. The deal is off.
You yielded in the past. You will do so again.
That's what gets me. It's like this was their plan all along. First to initiate contact, that foot in the door technique, and then to gradually every few decades return and demand more and more children. 10% in 2009, but then what? If you take that pattern and extrapolate it out, the 456 could eventually seek to turn the human race into nothing more than a farm planet, enslaved as cattle for the sole purpose of rearing children for trafficking. It even references the infant mortality rate and how humans cope with losing a child every 3 seconds by accepting and adapting. So it believes another couple million is just a drop in the ocean. Imagine that was their plan. What that would do to the psychology of the human race, knowing that every few decades the 456 would return to take more children. You'd end up with seasons where people would have an abundance of children, and then in the wake of the 44-year anniversary, people would stop in fear of their children being ripped away from them. But it does beg the question why the 456 would need so many children. From the footage inside the 456's room, we can see that one of the 11 children taken in 1965 is still sustaining the ambassador with a drug. So even if you say worst case scenario that the same 456 has used all 11 children for itself, and has returned for more, that means one child could last roughly 4 years. But best case, it's been using the same child for this entire time, and a single child can sustain for at least 44 years. It makes you wonder how vast the 456 is as a species. They've returned for 10% now, but if one child can sustain them for so long, then who is the 10% for? Maybe they're planning to traffic the children across the galaxy. Maybe their technology of using children for drugs can be applied to multiple different species, or perhaps their own species just numbers in the millions and beyond. Either way, you can get away with extracting a handful of children from Earth and not affecting the ecosystem like they did in 1965. But start taking out 10, 30, even 50% of the children, and suddenly you're looking at an ageing population crisis. They couldn't feasibly rely on humanity to do their own population control if you're taking out potentially half of the children each time, especially given how people would likely react. But if they were to step in, if they were to overthrow planet Earth and take over as rulers, they could bring humanity to its knees, imprisoned on their own planet with men and women brought together for nothing more than breeding, like animals in a zoo. I know it's complete theory, and who knows how far the 456 would have taken it, especially given they essentially gave up once the ambassador was defeated. But as far as fictional fears go, is there anything more terrifying than that? But that does leave me wondering just how powerful the 456 truly are as a species. Are they even capable of overthrowing Earth in the first place? At first glance, it looks like their powers eclipse our own, being able to produce a frequency that completely overrides children's motor function, and their attack on Thames House being able to not only lock it down, but release a deadly chemical at the same time. But when you really think about it, is there anything humans couldn't do? Jack was literally able to copy that transmission frequency with their own Torchwood technology, and we all know how dangerous chemical warfare is in the hands of humanity. Apart from the obvious spacecraft and teleportation tech, the fundamental weapons they used against humanity weren't actually that much more advanced than their own. And then you have the fact that they literally surrendered the moment their ambassador was defeated. Did the 456 actually just play an incredible psychological trick in humanity? The public reaction gives us good insight on that front when people mention being terrified of their own children. It's like the 456 were using our weakest point against us to try and send us into this frenzy before we could make any sort of rational judgment. What if there was no warship in the sky? Imagine the 456 were really just a group of college kid equivalent aliens who randomly stumbled across Earth and just wanted to get high. It's crazy to consider the amount of questions we still have about the 456. How powerful they are, how they keep children young for so long, how large their species was, and yet the government so quickly and easily decided the best course of action was to completely fold and hand over 10% of the world's children to them. And that brings us to possibly the most sinister aspect of the 456. They do something that only the best villains can, by inducing fear not only in how terrifying they are in themselves, but also revealing something about our own nature as human beings in the way we respond to them. One of the best examples I've ever seen of this is how the Joker tries to show the world who Harvey Dent really is by turning him into Two-Face, and we realise that even the best of us can fall. It's not just the Joker that's a fictional fear in a dark night, it's what the chaos he releases turns everyone else into, how everyone responds to it. And the 456 reflect their own terrifying reality for humanity by forcing the government's hand so that we see them for who they truly are, with some of the most disturbing conversations in the entire series. From trying to paint the 10% deal as a potential positive and something they can spin as a good thing in the media thanks to overpopulation, all the way to deciding the most vulnerable and deprived children should be the ones used as sacrifices for the more privileged. They even despair at one point that their brothers and sisters aren't exempt like they are. An MP even asks how she can possibly look her brother in the eyes and tell him, as though the entire country isn't going to have to do exactly the same thing. I think it perfectly conveys how I imagine government officials talk about the public, how they perceive the very people they're supposed to represent. And the scariest thing is, this depiction doesn't surprise me in the slightest, and it wouldn't if anything even remotely similar ever happened. The disgustingly disturbing nature of their conversations, how casually they discuss the method of choosing the children they sacrifice. I think that's a hyperbolized reminder of the stark reality of human nature, something John finds out towards the end of the series when he faces the reality of what they've done, when his children are chosen as token sacrifice of the 10%. I think that was the perfect bridge between the chilling nature of the government and how easily they folded and simply rounded up the 10%, versus the compilation of scenes showing the children being rounded up alongside John's final moments. Humanity's reaction to the 456 was almost as disturbing as the 456 themselves, and I thought Gwen's monologue about the Doctor was perfect.
Sometimes the Doctor must look at this planet and turn away in shame.
That's the beauty of Torchwood. It tackled the aspects of human nature Doctor Who was always too afraid to face, and the 456 really might be the pinnacle of Torchwood, of what made it so incredible. It dared to go where no one else would, and created quite possibly the most disturbing villain of all time.